This is the podcast of INCACT, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. In this series, we interview extraordinary professionals from the cultural management and policy community. Join us to hear their stories, the secrets of their success, and their advice for creating innovation by inspiring new policies and practices in the cultural, education, and research sector.
To start the year, we have decided to give the floor to the winner of our Cultural Research Award 2019, Biljana Tanurovska. INCACT is extremely committed in advance the research field. We have a lot of activities that we have designed and we implemented to this scope. One of these activities is providing emerging and young researchers the opportunity to publish an excellent work and being disseminated and promoted at international level. Biljana was recognized by our international jury as an excellence in the field of research, and we are very proud of the work that she has provided. The book is now live since already few months, and I'm sure that Biljana is extremely happy to the result. The talk of today will start with the introduction of the research that Biljana has conducted, and after she will be challenged by her tutor, mentor, Milena Dragićević, who has accompanied Biljana during this process of drafting the book of the Research Award. Biljana is a co-founder and executive director of Locomotiva. It's a center for new initiative in arts and culture. He's also co-founder of Nomad Dance Academy and Kinu Culture, a space for project for performing arts and culture. So she knows what she's talking about. So Biljana, I give you the floor to learn from your research. Good morning, Biljana. Thank you so much for being with us today. Your deep understanding of the current and future perspective on management and governance for arts and culture organizations is due to the investigation on this topic that you have done in the past few years. The result of your work are now available on a book published in the autumn 2022 with the support of INCACT. Could you please tell us more about this publication?
So I have this 20 minutes to present, or actually just to open up some questions that are tackled in the book. So I will start by saying that I have had the privilege and pleasure to be in New York 1 week ago, with the one collaboration that we have with the network GPS that we go almost every year, exchanging among US artists and artists from Central and South Europe. And I have this possibility to visit different performances, exhibitions, and also in this time exactly was the exhibition of Andrea Fraser, a performance artist, very well known about her work in the field of institutional critique, and one that inspired me while researching on the book, as also many others working in that field of institutional critique, but not only. And that's how I remember it. And again, I come back to this text that I remember very well from her, from the critique of institution to an institution of critique, coming from 2005, but still relevant. She says it is not a question of being against the institutions. We are the institutions. It is a question of what kind of institution we are, what kind of values we institutionalize, what forms of practice we reward, and what kinds of rewards we aspire to. And this perspective of Angela Fraser in the perspective of the book is that works on the questions on institution that tackles actually this theme that the work on the institution is continuous. And book offer only one perspective, and there are many more. And therefore, I think, and I advocate that we should continuously work on the question of the institutions and to reflect, to write, to think, and imagine always new institutional paradigms in culture and art.
In your book, you address the cultural institution as an ideological apparatus, meaning a power structure creating specific norms and convention. What does this mean in practice, and what are its consequences?
And it offers a view on institution, one that it's performing certain sociality, and each institution has its own way of thinking. What in this book is taken as how they think and how they perform, as I said, actually, it's also offer a proposal and perspective how we can think on how should an institution for contemporary performing arts think and perform today. Thus, understanding how they think institutions from inside to outside world also, it's important to understand their agency and what is our relation to them as audiences, as users, professionals, practitioners, or as ones within them. Thus, we can also think with them how to reframe, reform, reimagine, or queer them, as Silvia Bottiroli would also say, or to go further, how to make feminist institutions where we can develop systems of governing based on feminist values, among what first step, I would say, is the redistribution of power.
In your recent publication, you ask for a new type of cultural institution. Could you please elaborate more about this concept?
After I wrote the book from this 5 years distance, now talking with you, I see the potential to go further in thinking the feminist or queer institutions or intersectionalism to be applied in thinking them. However, no matter there is such an explicit perspective developed in the book, still position presented is the one that can be linked with it, since proposed system, ways of working, governing, thinking on them, on institution, is based on values that are care, interdependencies, generosity, distribution of power through self-organized horizontal system of hierarchies, or even more rhizomatic one, as I propose, that allows many entries without any verticality.
Do this type of innovative institutions exist already?
Since there are examples of such given, also elaborated in the book, some of them, among what Nomad Dance Academy, other organizations, platforms, and etc., Kinokultura as a proposal, and even more nowadays, we can see more attempts of building practices, organizations, institutions as such, where the art is run, co-curated, co-governed institutions, as well as programs, biennales, festivals, which are allowing different streams of conceptualizations and reforms of governing, managing, curating, if you want. Some of them nowadays, I can remember VHV Collective running the Kunsthalle Vienna, for example, Kai Theater, run by this excellent pair woman. Then we know about the Rouen Group as curators, which is a collective running the Documenta, and etc.
Why do you take in consideration the Balkan context specifically? What is the institutional landscape there?
Thus, traditional ones, as I name them standard model, are those that mainly remain in their system of operation and programming based on repertoire, program, and vertical communication, let's say. And on the other side, this book notices that this, what I call standard model, is related to the model of a public theater because I deal with the performing arts institution in Western Europe, which is rooted in the 19th century ideology of nationalism, which still is present. And such institutions are positioned as, I would call them, national authorities, which produce certain standards and art classifications, cultural canons, if you want, through what they communicate the public. But from such an authoritarian position, state created a certain context in which contemporary performing arts are developed, perceived and experienced as a subsystem, I would say, or marginalized still somewhere, and mostly in this region art form, as in the case in most of ex-Yugoslavia countries.
What is the role of civil society in this context? Can the management and policy community play a role?
What the book talks about, the contemporary performing arts, are not represented in the cultural policies and do not correspond, these policies, public policies specifically, cultural policies, to the needs of the field, but are marginalizing new approaches. Thus, contemporary performing arts can be found as situated and mostly developed through civil society initiatives, organizations, platforms, and collaborations, which operate as, I call them, agencies of action, forming new systems, models of governing, operating, producing, and disseminating. But this continued as a practice in the 20th century, so we can see in 80s, 90s, 2000, even nowadays in Europe, that institutions are questioned and has been reformed because also new professions emerge, such as dramaturgs, curators, and this we can notice also in the region. But the struggle to reform the institutions, to question them, reimagine them, has to continue still. And in the region, still we are thinking on establishing them. However, a lot is changing now in every manner, especially, as we know, after pandemic, the situation of wars, migrations, refugees. Thus, even more now, we have to continue rethinking, reflecting on the institutions, how they think and perform.
What do these new and different cultural institutions look like in practice?
Those are based on exchanges of resources as well as human and social capital. Those institutions are built on idea of collaboration, community, commonality, solidarity, equality, equity, and distribution of power as one of many different values in this direction. This perspective of post-managerial approach is related to a context-driven institutional model as an agency for socio-political transformation, or, as I call it, producer of sociality. Such institutions produce sociality and politically relevant content rather than only aesthetics that are indifferent to social reality in which they appear and function, which we can see mostly in these traditional conservative programations, curating and managing of the institution. In the book, I argue that heterogenic management and modeling or governing can be based on theoretical dimensions that support the possibility of a creation of other institutional imagination or underground or self-instituting system of cultural institutions, so such as I name them collaborative horizontal models, would not adhere to market, but would propose new managerial and governing logic that would support the articulation of experimentation. In relation to this, I propose also a post-institutional model, as I said, with this co-institution, the co terms, where co stands for collaborative, commons, coexisting, co-curating, co-leading, co-managing, even if you want, which is a logic that dismantle this centralized leadership, centralization of power in one entity or person or system or program or else, thus question or contest even all what we know as basis of stability and enter the logic of community or being together, or even if you want, not as one that opposes individual, but supporting the one to be more than individual in a collective, or to add now even this term trans-individual in Anna Vujanović and Bojana Cvejić term, meaning to dismantle the dichotomy between the individual and collective, but understand the creation of art as a process and a system and as a form of many, as a trans-individual process of individuals which are part of collectives.
Good morning, Professor Milena Dragićević, and welcome to this conversation. Why do you think this book is relevant for our community?
It was one of the first books in cultural management that was based on so-called value-based cultural management education, but also value-based cultural management practices. So bringing some other ideas of politics of care, of solidarity, of empathy, of, as she said, all these C's, co-curation, collaboration, etc., in the heart of the attention. It proposed a new concept, a new model of this post-managerial or postmodern cultural and art institution that has to be based on co-shared leadership, on participative leadership, to be really embedded in the context, but not in the contents of so-called ecosystem of culture, closed in itself, and relating that we, cultural operators, critics, theoreticians, relates only to each other. No, to be really embedded in community, in our real context, among subaltern, and she raised this issue today in her speak, that today she went further up speaking about queer institutions, feminist institutions, organizations, and so on.
Is a good practice to start moving in the direction suggested by Biljana. You refer to a project Stronger Peripheries, a Southern Coalition. Could you please tell us more about this project?
So, yes, we have there some really independent cultural organizations such as Bunker, already created in 1997. But we have as this consortium of a network of medium-sized cities in Catalonia, while, as I said, in Portugal, it's really small communities. And I'm not going to elaborate all of them. You just might see the list. But these are organizations that, in fact, in her PhD and in this book, basically Biljana imagined and debated theoretically as a future type, as a necessary type of organization. In this project, you see there is a 12 organization and 3 of us as university that I didn't describe because universities are more or less all the same, although we have, in this case, different capacities. University of Arts Belgrade is more art-based cultural management training. University of Lisbon is linked to urban studies, urban development. University of Barcelona, it's this cultural management, more classical, linking to economy department of these same universities. But all of that gave us such a perspective of understanding that initiatives and new forms of dealing with arts and culture management are today coming really from the margins, in this case from the south of Europe, but even margins of this south of Europe.
What does being involved in this kind of progressive project mean for academia and for the advancement of research on this topic?
All of these projects, in fact, why we are in them, it's because we as professors had been open to learn from our students that brought to us their knowledge from practice, their knowledge, but also their skills in imagining, in creating, in recreating cultural concepts and cultural organizations that we, up to that moment, were used to research and try to identify what exists, but not really be so free to imagine what should exist and how to create cultural organization that is going to be responsible, for example, for subaltern, not because it's a fashion, it's a la mode today to have, I don't know, once a week or once in a year, something devoted to Roma community, etc., but because there is a genuine need to be done.
A final reflection on skills. What kind of skills do you think cultural institutions, representatives, and researchers need to acquire in order to implement a new practice?
I think that's why it was valuable for me to think of how to produce knowledge, and to go to your questions. How to produce knowledge that can be critically reflected, that can kind of add to thinking and developing of this critical apparatus that can help in developing the skills. Because I think the production of these bases or platforms for critical thinking is the basis in developing the skills, as you mentioned. I don't know, advocacy skills, the leadership that can be, decentralizing power, this thinking about like queer institutions that would embrace differences and inequalities, or can think of this intersectionalism in a sense of feministic approach and etc., etc. So I wouldn't say that skills are not important to be discussed, of course are. But I see also the potential to bring this and to produce the knowledge firstly, which can afterwards continuously be, how to say, embracing the development of a different skills. I think we cannot exclude this knowledge and theoretical from the practice. And this, I think, is the best synergy that it's existing.
We have to have, first of all, skill to listen, to recognize problems and so on. So there would be probably, taking into account your book and what this book is offering as a new model and so on, a duty to us that are dealing with cultural management education and so on, to liberate cultural management education of this, of thinking that skills are only entrepreneurial skills, but to think about skills as entrepreneurial in a sense of creating new models of human communication, cultural dignity, and so on.
Actually, this is the starting point from where this research has started. And not to see this field in which we operate as cultural workers as only the one that exists to adhere this logic of the market necessities as the skills, but believing in this deep understanding of the context, the societies, the differences, and to make possibilities to analyze, to rethink, to reflect, and then to reform. So to develop actually this position and perspective from where, as I said, we can create these different social imaginaries. So the skills for me would be to be critical, to reflect, to go in depth analytically in order to imagine and create different social imaginaries or cultural imaginaries in which we operate.
You have been listening to the podcast of INCACT, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. To learn more about us, our activities, and how to become a member, visit incact.org.